What is up, my friends and fellow busy bees? You loved the podcast last week talking all about mistakes to avoid making on your furniture flips. Last week was specifically all about the hardware we use, the hardware we choose, and things you can avoid doing. If you have not yet listened, be sure to go back and listen to that. But today we're talking all about mistakes to avoid when it comes to paint washing your pieces. Paint washing is a technique that has definitely grown in what seems like popularity over the last couple years. When I first started doing this work, I didn't see as many people doing it as much. Now, whether people were actually doing it and just not like posting it on social media and stuff like that, I don't know. But over the last couple years, I've definitely seen it become more of a trend, especially as more of the lighter wood and the kind of pottery barn restoration hardware-esque looks have really come into popular trends and interior design. And for those that do not know, a paint wash is when you have a wood piece typically and you are mixing paint and water to create essentially a wash. It's not opaque paint, but it has the paint color in it, and you're putting that over the piece so it takes on the coloring but doesn't necessarily have the opacity of a full-on paint. So you can really control the tone of the wood. This is great when you're trying to lighten pieces, like I mentioned, or if you're trying to color correct as well. I recently posted a tutorial on Instagram and TikTok about how I took this mahogany, very red tallboy dresser that a client brought to me, and I was able to lighten it to give it that kind of like a light weathered oak look, which was very far from where it started. And in order to do that, in addition to some other techniques, I applied a paint wash. And I've used it on other pieces in the past. There's definitely some go-to colors that I'll typically use depending on the wood or the veneer that I'm putting it on and the general look or vibe that I'm trying to get from the piece. I won't go into those specifically today, but if you're interested in knowing what they are, let me know and I can include that in future episodes. But today I'm bringing you 5 mistakes to avoid when you are paint washing. The first mistake to avoid is sticking with the same color for every whitewash that you do. And if it wasn't apparent, a whitewash is a paint wash with the color white specifically. You see this a lot of time in like farmhousey kind of looks. It's very white, it's very bright. It doesn't necessarily look like wood to me, because, wood doesn't naturally occur in that color. But it's really nice, especially if you have a color that you've painted the piece and you're just kind of whitewashing the top and you're trying to find a tone that works well with that color, or if there's other similar pieces in the room that you're trying to coordinate this piece with, but you want the texture of the wood to be there alongside the color of the white if you have like other white pieces, for example. It's a really nice option to do. However, if you're using the exact same white for every single piece that you do, you probably aren't finding the most ideal fit for that piece. And the reason for that is that, like I mentioned, wood species are all different. They have different tones and undertones to them, and so if you're using the same white on every single one of them, chances are that color is going to skew in one direction or another based on those woods that are underneath, and it might look super stark against it. Or you might get an unideal outcome. For example, if you have, let's say, a cherry wood or a mahogany wood, which are really red in tone, if you go in right on top of those with a whitewash, depending how opaque or not that wash is, it's probably just going to give you a pink wood-looking piece, which might be what you're going for. We aren't that far away from the year of the Barbie movie, after all. But if you're looking for something a little more neutral and something that looks more like natural wood, you're going to want to take into account the undertones of that wood and do some color correcting to try and neutralize those tones. If you want to color correct, you can bring up a color wheel if you're not familiar with it off at the top of your head. Basically, this is a wheel of all of the colors of the rainbow, and when you look at that color wheel, you can look at the colors that are adjacent or opposite to a piece of that wheel, and it will tell you what colors coordinate well with it, or which ones will counteract those tones. So for example, red and green are on opposite sides of the color wheel. So if you have something that's really red toned, you can go in with something green toned and that will neutralize that red to a more neutral tone. Now, if we want to get really technical, there's undertones you have to take into account when you're looking at those reds and those greens and make sure that those are ones that line up well, but we won't get into that. But looking at this color wheel and having a good idea of what it is and the colors and where they're located can really help you with this. If you need to color correct or if you're looking for colors that would look good together. Some other opposites are things like orange and purple. If you need a good way to think about this, for example, if you are someone that has really dark bags under your eyes and they're kind of purplish, you would put an orange colored concealer over top of them to neutralize that color before going in with another more neutral concealer on top of it so that that purple wasn't sticking through. I don't know if we have any other makeup girlies out there, but this is very basic color correcting 101 when it comes to concealer and foundation. Also, if you have rosacea or a lot of redness in your skin, you would use a green color corrector. You would go in with that first, and then you would go in with your foundation to help to mask that redness. So think of this color correction when you are choosing the white that makes most sense for your piece, and make sure that you're looking at if there's other colors on that piece, like you've painted other portions of it, maybe there's a liner on there that you'll see at the same time as seeing where the piece is paint washed, maybe the room that it's going in, if it's a piece for yourself or for a client. You can take a look at the color that's on there, the tone of the color on the walls, what is the undertone, is it cool, is it warm, is it more neutral? And that will help you to choose which whitewash makes the most sense, because it's not often that I go in with just a stark, pure white for my whitewashes. Typically, it's one that has a little bit of a gray undertone, one that maybe has a little bit of kind of like a purpley undertone, something like Algonquin by Fusion Mineral Paint, or something that has a little bit more warmth in it, a little creaminess, like Champlain by Fusion. I also often use Burlap by Dixie Belle Paint because it's a little bit warm, but it's still neutral, and next to cool tones, it kind of leans a little bit cooler. So it has a lot of adaptability and flexibility in the color. So having a few ideas of different options that you can choose for that is great. And also sometimes you have to layer those colors and do a paint wash of one, and then you'll see that a certain undertone might be coming through, and you might want to do a paint wash with another color or integrate another color into that paint wash to help to mix it up and neutralize different tones. A lot of times paint washing is trial and error, in my opinion, when it comes to the ratio that you're doing, when it comes to the colors that you're putting in, especially if you're trying to match another piece and get a similar tone in the wood. It takes a lot of layering, and it takes a lot of eyeballing it and figuring it out as you go, so don't get discouraged. But just know that if you're sticking with the same white for every whitewash that you do, chances are it's not the most ideal fit for that piece that you're doing. And if you took a little bit of time and considered some other factors, you might be able to find a color that would flow a little bit better with that piece. She says, while also acknowledging that it's so handy just to have one white that you keep on hand that you can use for every single piece. I get it. But if we're talking in an ideal world, in an ideal design, and bringing together interiors seamlessly, this is a mistake that you want to avoid. I kind of jumped the gun because mistake number 2 to avoid when it comes to paint washing is forgetting to color correct to account for the undertone of the wood. We just went into it, but take a look at the piece that you have, and if you are trying to really bring that wood tone in a completely different direction, again, keep that color wheel handy and take a look at it. Another tool that is at your disposal at all times and is really helpful is ChatGPT. You can always use a color picker on your phone, figure out the hex code for the tone of the wood as it currently is, and then ask ChatGPT, I currently have unfinished pine wood. I want to do a paint wash over it to match this hex code. What would you recommend mixing from the Fusion Mineral Paint line or something like that? Work smarter, not harder. Sometimes it works best just to eyeball it, but it doesn't hurt to use tools like this at your disposal to start you off in the right direction, if nothing else, and save you a lot of frustration, time, effort, and wasted product along the way as well. Speaking of wasted product, mistake number 3 to avoid when it comes to paint washing is adding the water before your paint when you're making a paint wash. I have seen so many people with like a full red solo cup of paint wash when they're doing just like a side table or a small piece. And I just know that that's watered down so much more than it needs to be, or they've used way more product than need be to achieve the amount of product that they'll actually use on that surface. And depending on the paint line, a paint wash doesn't really like maintain long term. Like you can't really make a big batch of it and then keep it on the shelf and then use it again in like a month. You can, I guess, but it separates and the paint itself tends to separate, so you'll get like the undertones kind of sitting on the surface of the water. You really have to be sure to integrate it and get all of the paint off of the bottom, mix back in, and then it doesn't always come together the same. So while I totally understand that you don't want to not have enough to use to finish the project, especially if it's a custom mix of like multiple colors together, build that up from adding paint first and then adding water in versus putting the water in and adding the paint. Because if you have too much water in that mixture, it's going to break and it will be way too watery, and you'll have to add way more product than you would have if you did the opposite in order to achieve a more viscous, kind of opaque-ish finish. So, add your paint in, kind of cover the surface of the bottom of the red solo cup, for example. Mix in your colors, kind of get that mixed in, and then add a similar amount of water. Mix it up. How's it looking? Do you need to add a little bit more paint? Okay, it's looking good color-wise, but it's a little bit too thick and opaque. Okay, let's add a little bit more water. Add small amounts of water as you go, like a tablespoon at a time, and mix, and then check it, and then add some more, and then mix. You want to be intentional with this because once it's too watery, it requires like a quarter cup of paint to get it thicker and mixed in, and then you just have way too much. And you've used so much more paint than need be. And as always, we are trying to decrease the cost of the supplies that we use in our flips so that we can increase the amount of profit and money in our pockets once we sell our pieces. And even if you're keeping the piece for yourself, it's better to like have some leftover product after the fact. Maybe you have enough to do another little piece with the leftovers once you're done with your piece. So make sure you add that paint in first and then follow it up with the water versus doing the opposite. And for me, I typically do about a 50-50 mix of paint to water. I'll put a coat on the piece, see how it's looking, and then let it dry, and then kind of like sand it lightly and see how I'm liking how thick the opacity is. And then if I need to, I'll add more water to thin that out a bit, and I'll go in with a little bit of a thinner second coat. Because once you put the wash on there again, it's kind of moving around the layer that's underneath it anyways, depending how watery it is. So even if it is a little bit too opaque the first time around, it usually thins out anyways, versus doing the opposite, and then you just end up having to do a lot more layers and put in a lot more time because you're having to build that up so much and waiting for the dry time in between. So just a little FYI, if you've never mixed one up before, that's what I like to do. And mistake number 4 to avoid making when paint washing is not checking on how the top coat is going to look once you add the paint wash on. Because although this is paint that is in there, and when you typically paint a piece, the top coat being added on doesn't change the color a lot. I guess with some darker colors it can deepen it a little bit, but similarly, even if it's a light color, a top coat's going to just change that paint wash a little bit. It might look a little bit more opaque and matte as is, but once some moisture is added to that, you'll notice that it kind of tends to warm up the look of the wood a little bit more. So grab a really lightly dampened cloth and run it over the surface of the drawer front or whatever you're working on after it has dried thoroughly so that you're not wiping away any of the product. And whatever it looks like when it's damp will be what that will look like once there's top coat on it. But if you don't do that, then you're going to probably put on less layers than you think you need if you're trying to achieve a certain look. Because if it looks one way when it's dry, it's going to lighten a little bit once it gets some product on there in terms of a polyurethane and things like that. So make sure that you take the time, you check in on it, and then you'll know for sure if you're done and ready to move on to the next step, or if you need to put another layer or two on of the wash to get it to the depth of color that you're looking to achieve. I find this happens a lot when it comes to those red toned woods, again, the cherries, the mahoganies, because although something over top of it that's a whitewash or something that's a little bit off of white so that you can counteract and color correct for those reds, will tend to look a little bit more pink once it gets that top coat on there. So make sure in particular with those colors of woods that you are checking in and taking a look, or again, you might end up with Barbie's dresser. I warned you. And the fifth mistake to avoid when it comes to paint washing is to defer to paint washing because you're scared of staining. And I kind of think that this is maybe why some people tend to opt for a paint wash, because I find that a lot of people, I shouldn't say a lot, there have definitely been people that I have encountered that say that they strictly paint and that they don't refinish or restore pieces in terms of staining them. And I do just wonder why that is. I don't really explore that with people because, do what you want. Makes no difference in my life. However, I don't find staining to be all that difficult, especially when these people are at times sanding down the pieces fully in order to then prime and paint the pieces. Like, you're already halfway there. And in fact, I find staining to be a little bit more forgiving because you're not having to worry about things like paint strokes or getting fluffies in the finish. Like, putting a stain on, I use oil-based stains in particular. I don't love the look of a water-based stain. I find they look a little bit streaky, but oil-based stains, they just sink right into the wood. As long as you use a wood conditioner, especially if it's a really porous wood or a very dry, older wood, put a wood conditioner on, let it sit for a bit, then add your stain on. Let it sit so it thoroughly dries, and then you can top coat it. Like, it's pretty quick and easy. A lot of the times you don't need to do multiple coats of stain depending how light or dark you want the look to be. Whereas I very rarely see a paint that is full coverage on the first layer. So for me, depending how ornate the piece is and what condition it's in and things like that, I kind of prefer to stain pieces anyways. However, I do tend to whitewash, like I said, when I need to do a lot of color correcting, or if there's a stain that's not readily available to me that is the right color or tone for the look that I'm trying to achieve, either for the piece I'm working on to sell or for a client more specifically, because often they have a specific vision in their mind of what they want it to look like. They saw a picture on Pinterest, or they maybe have another piece that they're trying to emulate and things like that. In those cases, the paint wash definitely gives me more flexibility in terms of mixing custom colors and not having to sand it all the way back necessarily if it's not quite what I wanted it to be the first time and it starts to lean a certain way or have a certain tone to it. But a lot of the times paint washing can be a little bit of a bitch. It can be streaky, sometimes the wood doesn't take it the same, and it can look kind of patchy and weird, especially if it's not opaque enough, or it can look unnatural if it's the wrong color. So I think personally it's a lot harder to paint wash across the board, like when we look at pieces overall in your average piece, than it is to stain. So if you have tried paint washing in the past and you've been frustrated with the outcome, you couldn't get it to look the way you wanted it to, or maybe you're trying to recreate a look of somebody you saw online and it didn't look quite right, I would recommend trying out staining if you have not already, because you may find that that is way less burdensome, and stains go a really long way as well. You can get one of the small Varathane or Minwax cans for like $15, and that will last for at least a couple projects if they're larger. And if you're working on smaller things, you can get like 4 projects out of it. And I find that that can create such a rich tone as well in the wood in a way that you just can't really emulate with a paint wash. It really enhances the wood grain and it gives it that natural element that a lot of people really like. Again, there's a time and place and design for paint washing, but if you have been nervous to try out staining, let this be me giving you permission to give it a go, see how you like it, try it out on a piece. And honestly, worst case scenario, if you hate it, you could always sand that back once it's dried and then go in with a paint wash later. Any mistake in this world can be undone. Do not forget that, my friends. And something you may not know about me, I love little motivational messages. They always get me fired up, and I keep a list of ones that are especially catchy or speak to me in the Notes app on my phone. So I end every podcast episode with one that I've noted down over the years in hopes that you leave our time here each week feeling inspired, motivated, and ready to take on whatever comes your way this week. So this week's Mel's motivational message is, I am not afraid of storms, for I am learning how to sail my ship. because in life, even if you feel like you have it all together and you've got it figured out and things are flowing smoothly, we are all just learning how to sail our ships. We are trying to figure out this place and navigate this landscape and deal with things as they pop up. And by the way, every other person that you encounter on Earth is also doing the same. So don't be afraid of the storms that pop up. If you're working on a piece and you try to do a paint wash, but it's looking splotchy and it's not looking good, don't feel defeated by that piece. Take a breather, take a break from it, do some research. Figure out, is it the ratio that I'm doing that might not be ideal? Is it the color that maybe looks off and I need to find something that has a better undertone, or I need to do some color correcting first? Is this a piece that really lends itself to a paint wash? Should I maybe try staining it instead? Should I be adaptable in the face of this storm and think up other options and other ways forward, or should I just let my ship sink? Spoiler alert, you should not let your ship sink. So remember that as you move through your week, we are all just trying to figure it out. Don't be afraid of the storms that may pop up. Don't waste time and energy being anxious and worried about things that may or may not happen. Because at the end of the day, if they do happen, which probably they won't, because 85% of the things that we worry about in our day-to-day do not actually end up occurring, by the way. You are needlessly worrying and spending time and energy and mental effort on that thing that will never occur. Just a quick FYI. But don't worry about those storms. You will figure it out. You will find the way to sail your ship through. And when you get to the beautiful sunset on the other side, you will be so happy and satisfied with yourself for having made it. Because you're adaptable, you're resilient, you got it figured out. Lean into your intuition. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help when you need it. You got this. I believe in you. All right, that's it for now. I appreciate your time, and I will catch you guys next week.